The night of the 17th of June, 1944, is moonless and thick with summer warmth as a pilotless aircraft climbs away from its launch ramp on the French coast. It is small, almost absurdly so, 25 feet of welded steel tube and plywood wings, powered by a pulse jet engine that produces a sound quite unlike anything the world has heard before. A mechanical flatulence, a stuttering roar that rises and falls with metronomic regularity as the engine ingests air, ignites fuel, and expels exhaust in rapid, rhythmic cycles. The sound carries for miles. People in Kent and Surrey, roused from their sleep by that distinctive, crackling drone, have already learned to count their blessings while it continues. It is when the noise stops, when the engine cuts out and silence descends, that fear truly takes hold. This particular aircraft carries a warhead of 1,874 pounds of amatol explosive. It is traveling at approximately 400 miles per hour at an altitude of 3,000 feet, following a preset gyroscopic course towards the coordinates of central London. Its designers call it the Fieseler FY-103. The British press has already christened it the Doodle Bug, or the Buzz Bomb. The Air Ministry knows it as the V1, Vergeltungswaffe 1, Vengeance Weapon 1. And over the 10 weeks that have just begun, more than 10,000 of them will be launched at Britain. Nobody aboard a Royal Air Force fighter orbiting the darkness above the English countryside that night can see it yet. The aircraft's small silhouette is nearly invisible against the dark sky, and the exhaust flame, a blue-orange plume trailing from the pulse jet, offers only a fitful, uncertain signature. The pilots in their Hawker Tempests and de Havilland Mosquitoes are hunting by sound and instinct as much as by sight. Some have already tried to shoot these things down. Some have succeeded. But the challenge is immense, and the mathematics of the problem, laid bare in the morning briefings of the Air Defence of Great Britain, are frankly appalling. Britain needed a solution. What it found was one of the most elegantly conceived and comprehensively executed defensive campaigns in the history of aerial warfare. A solution that wove together radar, guns, balloons, and the exceptional performance of a handful of remarkable aircraft into a system that would, by the campaign's end, be destroying more than 80% of all V1s before they reached their target. The story of how that figure was achieved, rising from catastrophic early failure to something approaching mastery, is one of the great untold engineering and tactical stories of the Second World War. The V1 campaign began formally on the 13th of June, 1944, 1 week after the Allied landings in Normandy, though German planning for such a weapon stretched back to 1942. The weapon itself was a product of competing German military philosophies and genuine technical brilliance. Developed at the Fieseler Aircraft Company and the Army Research Center at Peenemünde, the Fe-103 represented an entirely novel approach to strategic bombardment. Rather than building ever larger conventional aircraft to deliver bombs, the Germans proposed to build the bomb itself as the aircraft. The warhead was integral, the delivery system was expendable, the economics were devastatingly attractive. Each V1 cost approximately 5,000 Reichsmarks to produce, a figure that compares favorably with the tens of thousands of Reichsmarks required for a conventional bomber, which additionally required a trained crew of several men, consumed fuel on both the outbound and return journeys, and was vulnerable throughout its mission to interception. The V1 required no crew. It consumed fuel only in one direction. Its loss on arrival was not merely acceptable, but intended. Produced in vast underground factories, principally in the Mittelwerk complex, carved into the Kohnstein mountain near Nordhausen, V1S rolled off improvised production lines at rates that steadily climbed towards several hundred per week. The weapon's design was deceptively simple in concept, though formidable in execution. The fuselage was a welded steel tube 66 inches in diameter and 25 feet in length. Two small wings, constructed primarily from plywood and sheet metal, spanned 17 feet 7 inches. Atop the rear fuselage sat the pulse jet engine, An Argus IS 109-014 unit that operated on a principle first articulated in 1906 by a French engineer named Georges Laurent. Air entered through a set of spring-loaded intake valves at the front of the combustion chamber. Fuel was injected and ignited. The resulting explosion forced the intake valves shut, creating a pressure pulse that drove exhaust rearward for thrust. As the pressure equalized, the intake valves sprang open again, admitting fresh air, and the cycle repeated, approximately 47 times per second at operating speed. The resulting sound was immediately distinctive, a rapid, mechanical put-put-put that gave the weapon its most enduring nickname. Navigation was achieved through a gyroscopic autopilot of reasonable sophistication. A magnetic compass maintained directional heading, a barometric altimeter maintained altitude, a small propeller mounted on the nose counted revolutions as the V1 flew, and when a preset count corresponding to the target distance had been reached, a mechanism deflected the elevators sharply downward, pushed the fuel cutoff, and placed the weapon in a steep dive towards its target. This final maneuver, the abrupt cut of the engine followed by the silent, plunging descent, was what gave the V1 its particular psychological horror. The silence meant arrival was imminent. There was no warning. There was no further time to seek shelter. The initial British response was, to put it charitably, woefully disorganized. The existence of the V1 program had been known to British intelligence since November 1943, when aerial reconnaissance of Peenemünde, supplemented by reports from agents in occupied Europe, had revealed the characteristic shape of the launch ramps being constructed along the French coast. Operation Crossbow, the Allied program to bomb these installations, had consumed enormous resources throughout the winter and spring of 1944. By the time the campaign opened in June, a great deal of concrete had been struck and a great deal of ordnance expended, but the Germans had responded with characteristic ingenuity. They had built modified, simpler launch sites that were smaller, easier to camouflage, and faster to erect. The opening salvos of June 1944 demonstrated with brutal clarity that Crossbow had not neutralized the threat. The scale of the problem became apparent almost immediately. During the first week of the campaign, more than 2,000 V1s were launched. Of those that completed their crossing of the Channel and reached British soil, a figure complicated by mechanical failures, navigation errors, and the attrition of early defences, an alarming proportion were reaching and detonating in Greater London. The consequences were catastrophic. The V1 that struck the Guards' Chapel at Wellington Barracks on the 18th of June, 1944, during a Sunday morning service, killed 121 people and wounded 141 more in a single detonation. Across London, the sustained campaign produced a hemorrhage of civilian casualties that the capital had not endured since the Blitz of 1940 and 1941. The defensive system that existed in June 1944 was simply not adequate to the task. The guns of Anti-Aircraft Command, positioned primarily in a belt running through the North Downs of Kent and Surrey, were achieving hit rates that their commanders described in private communications as pathetic. The problem was not the quality of the gunners. It was not the quality of the guns. It was the nature of the target. The V1 flew faster than almost anything the British air defences had previously been asked to engage. At 400 miles per hour at 3,000 feet, it represented a small, fast, low-altitude target that pushed conventional anti-aircraft gunnery to its absolute limits. The standard British predictor equipment, electromechanical computers designed to calculate where a target would be at the moment a shell arrived, given the target's present course and speed, was struggling to keep pace. Shell after shell passed harmlessly through the air where a V1 had recently been. The fighter pilots faced equally daunting challenges. The RAF's frontline aircraft in June 1944 included the Supermarine Spitfire in its various marks and the Hawker Typhoon, but neither was optimally suited to catching V1s. The Spitfire Mark 7 and Mark 9, formidable at altitude, lost much of their performance at the low levels where V-1s flew. The Typhoon, intended as a low-level fighter and ground attack aircraft, was fast, but not fast enough at 3,000 feet to guarantee a comfortable overtaking speed. Pilots who did manage to position themselves behind a V-1 discovered new problems: the warhead detonating in front of them if they fired at close range, or structural damage to their own aircraft from the pulse jet exhaust blast. Several pilots had their windscreens cracked. Others reported their aircraft thrown violently by the wake turbulence of the weapon's passage. The solution to the fighter problem emerged from two sources simultaneously: the development of genuinely faster aircraft and the evolution of tactics suited to the unique characteristics of the target. The Hawker Tempest, Mark 5, which entered squadron service in 1944 with No. 150 Wing at Newchurch in Kent, proved to be the aircraft best suited to anti-doodlebug work. Powered by the Napier Sabre 2A engine, a 24-cylinder H configuration unit producing 2,180 horsepower, the Tempest was capable of approximately 435 miles per hour at 18,500 feet, and crucially, it maintained excellent performance at low altitude. At 2,000 feet, it could achieve speeds that gave a comfortable margin over the V-1's cruise velocity, allowing pilots to set up careful beam or stern attacks from beyond the lethal radius of the warhead's detonation. The tactics that developed were sophisticated and, in some cases, strikingly unconventional. The most reliable method of destroying a V-1 from behind was to open fire from a range of no less than 200 yards, directing cannon shells into the weapon's fuel tank or engine. The preferred burst was short, a 2-second deflection shot aiming ahead of the target, and pilots quickly learned to brake sharply after firing to avoid debris. The mathematics of the engagement were demanding. A closing speed of perhaps 30 miles per hour meant that a pilot had only seconds from achieving firing range before he was dangerously close to the weapon. The margin for error was slim. Some pilots developed an even more remarkable technique. Wing Commander Roland B. Mont of No. 150 Wing was among the first to discover that a V-1 could be destroyed without firing a single round. By flying alongside the weapon and positioning his wingtip beneath its wing, the aerodynamic interaction of the two lifting surfaces disrupting the V-1's gyroscopic autopilot, a pilot could literally tumble the weapon out of the sky. This technique, which became known as wing tipping or tilting, was not without risk. The pilot was flying at very low altitude alongside a weapon carrying nearly a ton of high explosive at close to maximum speed. But it preserved precious cannon ammunition, and in the hands of an experienced pilot, it worked with remarkable reliability. The Royal Air Force's success against the V-1 in the aerial interception role was real, but limited. By the end of the campaign, fighter pilots had accounted for approximately 1,847 V-1s, a significant figure, but representing only a fraction of the total launched. The decisive contribution came not from the air, but from the ground, and it required a transformation in anti-aircraft gunnery that can only be described as revolutionary. The central problem with conventional anti-aircraft gunnery against the V-1 was one of prediction accuracy and fuse reliability. A shell fired at an aircraft must be detonated at the right moment and in the right place, close enough to the target that the expanding fragmentation pattern intersects with it. Conventional time fuses, set before firing to explode after a calculated number of seconds, were adequate against slower, higher altitude targets where the target's position could be predicted with reasonable confidence. Against the V-1, moving at 400 miles per hour at low altitude with a small radar cross-section, the error margins in prediction were simply too large and the fuse timing too imprecise. The solution was the proximity fuse, officially designated the variable time fuse, or VT fuse, a name chosen partly for security reasons. The concept was straightforward. Rather than detonating a shell at a preset time, the fuse would detect the presence of a nearby target and trigger automatically. The implementation was anything but straightforward, miniaturizing a radar transmitter, receiver, and detonation circuit into something that could survive being fired from an artillery gun, experiencing accelerations of thousands of times the force of gravity, and that would function reliably in rain, salt air, extreme temperatures, and the electromagnetic interference of nearby gun muzzle blasts, was an engineering challenge that had seemed essentially impossible as recently as 1940. The proximity fuse had been under development in Britain since 1940, primarily at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, and development had subsequently been taken up in the United States under the auspices of the National Defense Research Committee, with work concentrated at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland. The American effort, resourced with the full industrial capacity of a nation not yet directly at war, had achieved a working fuse by 1942, and by 1944, production was running to many hundreds of thousands of units per month at facilities across the United States and in Britain. The fuse itself was a masterpiece of miniaturized electronics. Roughly the size and shape of a large electric light bulb, it contained 5 miniature thermionic valves, vacuum tubes in American terminology, along with resistors, capacitors, a small battery activated by the spinning of the shell in flight, and a Doppler radar transmitter operating at approximately 180 to 220 megahertz. When the shell was fired, the spin activated the battery and initialized the electronics. The transmitter broadcast a continuous radio signal outward from the shell's nose. When this signal reflected off a nearby target, at distances of up to 70 feet, depending on target size, the reflected signal returned to the fuse, slightly shifted in frequency due to the Doppler effect of relative motion. This frequency difference, detected by the receiver circuitry, triggered the detonation. The result was that a shell passing within lethal distance of a V1, close enough that its fragmentation pattern could damage or destroy the weapon, would automatically detonate at precisely the right moment. The gunner no longer needed to set a fuse time. The radar did the work. The improvement in effectiveness was not incremental, it was transformative. General Sir Frederick Pyle, Commander-in-Chief of Anti-Aircraft Command, recognized almost immediately that the combination of the proximity fuse with improved radar gun-laying equipment and a redeployment of his guns to the most tactically advantageous positions could fundamentally change the terms of the defensive battle. In mid-July 1944, Pyle oversaw one of the most rapid and comprehensive redeployments of heavy weapons in British military history. In the space of just 3 days, the 17th to the 19th of July, approximately 800 heavy anti-aircraft guns and 1,600 light guns were relocated from the North Downs to a new gun belt along the coast of Kent and Sussex, from Beachy Head to St. Margaret's Bay near Dover. The coastal position was chosen with cold tactical logic. By pushing the gun belt to the coast, the gunners gained clear fields of fire over the sea, where there were no friendly aircraft to endanger and no British structures to be struck by falling shells or prematurely detonated V1s. The V1s crossed the coast at a predictable height and on predictable headings, funneled by the geography of the channel crossing into approach corridors that the gun radar could cover comprehensively. The proximity fuses, combined with the SCR-584 radar gun laying system, an American development that could automatically track a target and continuously feed corrected aiming data to the guns, gave the gunners a system of unprecedented precision. The SCR-584 represented a genuine revolution in fire control. Unlike earlier gun-laying radars, which provided azimuth and elevation data that human operators then fed into mechanical predictors, the SCR-584 was fully automatic. It acquired a target, tracked it continuously, computed the necessary lead angle and fuse timing, and transmitted the fire control solution directly to the guns, which were servo-driven to follow the computed aim point. The human gunners, in this system, were effectively managers of a machine that could outperform any human predictor at the speeds involved. Against the V1, which flew straight and level on a predictable course, the combination of the SCR-584 and the proximity fuse was devastating. The improvement in gun effectiveness was almost immediate and almost unbelievable. In the first week of operations from the coastal gun belt, the kill rate climbed sharply. By August 1944, the guns were destroying 60% of all V1s that entered the gun zone. By the end of August, as the gunners gained experience with their new equipment and refined their procedures, the rate had climbed to over 70%. In a single exceptional 24-hour period in August, the guns destroyed 82% of all V1s that crossed their zone. The transformation from the desperate, largely futile gun defense of June to the systematic destruction of August represents one of the most rapid improvements in weapons effectiveness ever documented. The balloon barrage, a curtain of barrage balloons extending from Cobham in Surrey to Limpsfield in the east, with cables hanging at altitudes up to 5,000 feet, contributed a third layer of defense, though its contribution was more modest. Balloons could not engage fast-moving aircraft directly, but a V-1 flying into a balloon cable at 400 miles per hour experienced catastrophic structural damage. The cable, unable to withstand the impact force, would break, but not before imparting sufficient damage to the V-1's wing that the weapon would either immediately crash or fly erratically and crash shortly afterwards. The balloon barrage destroyed approximately 278 V-1s over the campaign, a figure that sounds modest but represents weapons that would otherwise have reached the capital. The integration of these three defensive elements, fighters in the outer zone over the channel and inland approaches, guns in the coastal belt, and balloons in the inner zone, created what the air defense of Great Britain termed the diver defenses, using the code name assigned to the V-1 campaign. The system was not without friction. Fighter pilots occasionally strayed into the gun zone and were fired upon. Guns occasionally engaged targets that turned out to be friendly aircraft that had failed to broadcast the correct identification signals. The boundaries between zones were matters of constant negotiation and occasional acrimony between the RAF and Anti-Aircraft Command. But the overall architecture was sound, and as the summer progressed, it became progressively more lethal to the V-1. The Germans were not passive observers of this transformation. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft, primarily the high-speed Junkers Ju-86 operating at extreme altitude, attempted to photograph the gun belt and assess the effectiveness of the defenses. German engineers reviewed the available data and introduced modifications to the V-1 intended to complicate interception. Later production versions flew at lower altitudes, sometimes as low as 1,000 feet, where they were harder for radar to acquire and track. Some variants were modified to fly faster, approaching 450 miles per hour, which reduced the margin available to even the fastest British fighters. A small number were launched from modified Heinkel, her 111 bombers operating over the North Sea, appearing from directions the coastal gun belt had not been positioned to cover, and requiring fighter squadrons to be repositioned to counter this threat. The most ambitious German countermeasure was the development of the Reichenberg, a manned version of the V-1 in which a pilot sat in a tiny cockpit ahead of the pulse jet intake, controlling the weapon manually for most of its flight, before theoretically bailing out before impact. The concept was championed by the aviator Hannah Reich and explored by a suicide squadron of volunteers. But the practical difficulties, bailing out of a vehicle traveling at 400 miles per hour at very low altitude, offered survival odds that even the most dedicated pilots found daunting, meant that the Reichenberg never entered operational service in significant numbers. The manned V-1 remained, in the end, an idea that human biology declined to make workable. The second of Germany's vengeance weapons, the A-4, universally known as the Vi-2, presented an entirely different and, in many respects, more fundamentally difficult defensive problem. Where the V-1 could be detected, tracked, and destroyed in flight, the V-2 could not. It was a ballistic missile. It rose to an apogee of 50 to 60 miles above the Earth's surface, traveling at velocities of up to 3,500 miles per hour, and descended almost vertically onto its target in a matter of seconds. There was no radar capable of detecting it in time. There was no gun capable of engaging it. There was no aircraft fast enough to intercept it. The V-2 arrived in absolute silence. Indeed, it arrived before the sound of its own approach, which followed the explosion by several seconds, and there was simply no direct technical means of stopping it once launched. The British response to the V-2 was therefore necessarily indirect, and it was in some respects the most consequential intelligence operation of the entire war. The challenge was threefold: to locate the launch sites from which V-2s were being fired, to determine the weapon's technical characteristics with sufficient precision to allow some assessment of its limitations, and to find means of disrupting its production and supply chain. All three required intelligence of exceptional quality, gathered from sources that were themselves operating under conditions of extreme danger. The first intact V-2 to fall into Allied hands arrived, improbably, in Sweden. On the 13th of June, 1944, the same day the Phi-1 campaign opened, a V-2 launched from the test range at Peenemünde malfunctioned and crossed the Baltic, coming down in Swedish territory near Bäckebo. Swedish authorities, maintaining a careful neutrality, permitted a British intelligence team to examine the wreckage. The team included Dr. R. V. Jones, the physicist who had been central to British countermeasures against the German radio navigation systems earlier in the war, and the technical information gathered from the Bäckebo components, including fragments of the guidance system, portions of the fuel and oxidant tanks, and elements of the warhead, was of significant value in understanding the weapon's characteristics. More dramatic still was the recovery operation mounted in Poland. The Polish Home Army, Armia Krajowa, had been observing V-2 test flights from Peenemünde that overflew Polish territory, and in late May 1944 they located a largely intact V-2 that had failed to detonate after landing in soft ground near the river Bug. The Poles disassembled the missile with extraordinary care, concealing components in a barn and establishing a courier network to transmit technical drawings, photographs, and eventually physical components to Britain. In July 1944, an RAF Dakota aircraft landed in a Polish meadow at night, loaded with V-2 components and Polish scientists, and took off again before German patrols could respond. The material it carried allowed British scientists at the Telecommunications Research Establishment and elsewhere to complete their technical picture of the V-2 with a level of detail that no amount of aerial reconnaissance could have provided. The intelligence picture that emerged confirmed what many had feared. The V-2 was beyond direct interception. The only viable military response was to attack the production facilities, supply lines, and launch areas as thoroughly as possible. Bomber Command and the United States Army Air Forces devoted substantial resources to striking the Mittelwerk underground factory, with limited success, given that the facility was buried beneath hundreds of feet of solid rock, and to attacking the network of depots, transport routes, and assembly points that supported V-2 operations. The campaign was useful but not decisive. V-2 launches continued until March 1945, when advancing Allied ground forces finally overran the launch areas in Holland. The strategic calculus of the V-weapons program remained intensely debated throughout the campaign and has been argued over by historians ever since. In material terms, the damage inflicted on Britain was severe, but not catastrophic. The V-1 campaign killed approximately 6,184 people in Britain, the large majority of them in London, and seriously injured more than 17,981. The V-2 killed a further 2,754 people in Britain, with 6,523 seriously injured. The total of approximately 9,000 dead, while a tragedy of enormous personal proportions for each individual family affected, was considerably less than the casualties inflicted on British cities during the Blitz of 1940 and 1941, and represented a relatively small fraction of total British war dead. The resources the V-weapons program consumed on the German side, however, were extraordinary. The economist Adam Tooze, examining the German wartime economy in his study of the subject, has estimated that the V-1 and V-2 programs together consumed resources equivalent to the construction of thousands of conventional aircraft. The labor required, much of it extracted from concentration camp prisoners under conditions of lethal brutality, a fact that lends the entire program a moral dimension that extends far beyond questions of military effectiveness, was drawn from the broader war economy at a time when German industrial capacity was already under severe strain. The proximity fuse, meanwhile, had consequences that extended far beyond the anti-Doodlebug campaign. Its successful deployment in the summer of 1944 was, in the considered view of most historians of military technology, one of the most significant advances in weapons effectiveness of the entire war. General George Marshall, the United States Army Chief of Staff, described the proximity fuse as one of the three most important technical developments of the war, alongside radar and the atomic bomb. This was not hyperbole. The fuse transformed anti-aircraft gunnery not merely against the V-1, but against conventional aircraft, and the principle it embodied, the use of active sensing to determine the optimal moment of detonation, remains fundamental to weapons design to the present day. The aircraft developed to counter the V-1 also bequeathed a lasting legacy. The Hawker Tempest, which had proven itself the most effective fighter in the anti-Doodlebug role, represented the evolutionary end of the piston-engine fighter lineage. Its successor, the Hawker Fury, appeared in the final months of the war, but by then the jet age was already dawning. The Gloucester Meteor, Britain's first operational jet fighter, powered by Rolls-Royce Welland engines, entered service in July 1944 and was immediately assigned to anti-Doodlebug operations. In the event, early Meteors proved to have limited advantages over the best piston-engine fighters in the low-altitude interception role. The jet's performance advantage at altitude was not available where the V-1s flew, but the campaign gave Meteor pilots and ground crews invaluable operational experience with jet propulsion at a time when that experience was rare and precious. By the time the last V-1 launch sites in France were overrun by Allied ground forces in September 1944, ending the main phase of the campaign, the diver defenses had achieved a kill rate that no defensive system of the Second World War had previously approached against a sustained bombardment campaign. In the final weeks, the guns alone were destroying more than 80% of all V-1s crossing the gun belt. Fighter pilots claimed a total of 1,847 kills. Anti-aircraft guns destroyed 1,878. Barrage balloons accounted for 278. The remainder fell to mechanical failure, navigation errors, and a small number of other causes. Of the 9,521 V-1s launched from French soil, only a fraction reached London. The gun-laying radar, the SCR-584, had contributed to this success in ways that cannot easily be captured in kill rate statistics. By automating the process of target tracking and fire control solution computation, it had effectively removed the human reaction time limitation from anti-aircraft gunnery. It had placed the gun in continuous, automatic engagement with the target from the moment of radar acquisition to the moment of firing. This represented a conceptual leap in military technology, every bit as significant as the proximity fuse itself. The replacement of human cognitive speed with electronic computational speed in the critical loop of target engagement. The systems that would evolve from this concept, the phased array radars and computer-controlled weapon systems of the late 20th century, trace a direct intellectual lineage to the SCR-584 batteries on the Kent coast in the summer of 1944. Several V-1s survive in museums. The Imperial War Museum in London displays one in its Second World War galleries, its battered steel fuselage and stubby wings offering a strangely intimate impression of the weapon that terrorized the capital for months. Others are preserved at the Royal Air Force Museum at Hendon, at the Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace at Le Bourget in France, and at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington. The proximity fuse, in its original American production form, can be examined at the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, where it was developed. The SCR-584, less glamorous than the weapons it helped to destroy, is harder to find, but examples exist in several military technology collections in the United States. The legacy of the summer of 1944 extends, ultimately, into every modern missile defense system in the world. When the Patriot batteries of the Gulf War engaged Iraqi Scud missiles, they were doing something that was conceptually descended from the diver defenses of 70 years earlier, using radar to detect and track incoming projectiles, computing intercept solutions at electronic speed, and employing active sensing fuses to maximize the probability of kill. When the Iron Dome system over Israel intercepts rockets fired from Gaza, it is enacting, in vastly more sophisticated form, a logic that General Pyle and his gunners understood perfectly, that the only answer to a weapon that cannot be stopped at source is a defense of such thoroughness and reliability that the weapon becomes militarily ineffective. The V-Weapons campaign demonstrated something else, too, something that the engineers and scientists who built the proximity fuse and the SCR-584 perhaps understood better than any strategist. The challenge of defense is not fundamentally a question of courage or determination, though those qualities matter. It is a question of engineering. It is a question of whether the defending side can develop, produce, and deploy the right technology quickly enough, and in sufficient quantities, and with sufficient operational sophistication, to overwhelm the offensive weapon's advantages. In the summer of 1944, Britain and its American allies passed that test. They did so not through any single dramatic breakthrough, but through the patient accumulation of technical advantage, a fuse here, a radar there, a faster aircraft, a better tactic, until the V-1, which had seemed in June to threaten London with potentially unsustainable destruction, had been reduced by September to a weapon that destroyed itself against British defences at a rate its designers had never imagined possible. The drone of a V-1 engine fades in the night air above the English coast. For a moment, the silence that follows is the silence of fear, the silence that civilians across Kent and Surrey have learned to dread above all other sounds. But then the guns speak, the radar locks, the proximity fuse does its work, and a fireball illuminates the dark sky over the channel. The weapon falls into the sea. London sleeps a little safer, and in that brief, violent exchange between a machine and its defenders, the future of aerial warfare has been quietly, irrevocably shaped.